Hey all, and welcome back to There's Danger Here. I'm Leilani, and it is the top of the month, so I am going to continue with another 4 cases from the MMIW cases. Let's begin, shall we? Brandy Vittrekwa was born in 1997 to mother Noreen in Whitehorse, Yukon. She was described as close-knit with her family, growing up with her brother and mother. When remembering Brandy, Noreen remembers one memory in particular. Quote, I was getting out the Christmas lights. It was December and her room was downstairs. I happened to look at her room and she just looked at me and smiled at me. And I have that moment in my head. End quote. Brandy was described by friends and family as outgoing, happy, and had a great sense of humor. Noreen also said, quote, she was beautiful, outgoing. She drew people to her, end quote. On December 7th, 2014, Brandy went out. When she didn't arrive home that evening, Noreen began calling her, stating, quote, I was trying to get a hold of her to come home, but she wasn't answering, end quote. She even messaged her on Facebook, but received no reply there either. On December 8th, a female was found on a walking trail in the city. The next day, police showed up at Noreen's door. Quote, they said there was a body found, but there were other girls missing, and they're not sure if it was Brandy. I was praying it wasn't her, end quote, said Noreen. But that afternoon, police unfortunately returned to her door to ask what Brandy was wearing, and then, based on that, were able to confirm it was her. Whitehorse RCMP investigated, and after 2 months of silence, the family was notified that a 15-year-old was charged with second-degree murder in her death. The teen, who isn't named because Canada doesn't name underage offenders as part of the Youth Criminal Justice Act, pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and during sentencing on June 16, 2016, received 2 years in jail and an additional year of supervision. This is apparently the maximum allowed for a youth sentence. Afterward, Noreen stated, quote, it's so hard. So hard. I expect her to come home, and she's not going to, end quote. I have to put this part in because I understand not naming teens, but that sentence for murder seems light, no matter how you weigh it. Here's the details I could find. In some reports, it sounds like Brandy was beaten to death by this teenager because she didn't accept his advances. That's it. She had the audacity to say no and set boundaries, and it threw him into such a rage that he beat her and drug her off the walking trail before heading home. Multiple sources claim he says he was on drugs at the time, but in the same breath as reporting that, said that while walking home, he actively thought that she would probably die if he simply left her there. And still, he continued home. And this wasn't the teenager's first offense either. He had already been in trouble for, rape and assault. So now we're establishing a pattern here. I've talked about many serial killers that follow this pattern, and by 15, this teen was willing to kill because a woman simply said no to him. Unfortunately, by 2018, he was released and went to British Columbia where he attended university. My hope is that the women there survived him. Prior to his release, family and the Kwanlin Dun First Nation chief Doris Bill also said she didn't believe the sentence reflected the severity of the crime. She raised the issue in Whitehorse during public hearings of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. They attempted to get his case reviewed for proper sentencing prior to his release. Instead, they found that prior to his release, he was granted, quote, reintegration leaves, end quote, where he would be allowed back into the community, to where he murdered another teenager as part of his program to get ready for life after being incarcerated. And that's unfortunately her case. Brenda Jeanette Campbell was 51, from Winnipeg, but had roots in Duck Bay and Camperville, Manitoba. She had several children and was known as kind, with a strong spirit. On July 7th, 2016, Brenda was staying at a 3-story rooming house in Winnipeg's North Point Douglas neighborhood. This house was set on fire, and while 5 people managed to escape the blaze, unfortunately Brenda and one other were killed as a result. By the time firefighters managed to reach the scene after being notified of the blaze beginning, news reported that every single story was already on fire, engulfed in flames. Winnipeg RCMP were treating the fire as intentional arson, making her death homicide. A year after the investigation started, in July of 2017, 2 men, Jonathan Graham Barstad, 34, and Edward Wade Beardy, 35, were charged with second-degree murder and 2 counts of arson with disregard for life. The RCMP reported that they believed the fire was set to target residents who had connections to gangs. Instead, however, this fire claimed the lives of Brenda and John McKinnon Brendan, a 61-year-old. They were not the intended victims, and of course, neither of them had any ties to anything, including gangs. Brenda is remembered by her family as a kind and humorous spirit who volunteered at a local women's shelter. Brenda Bearspaw was born on September 30th, 1989, to parents Geraldine Bearspaw and John Cito, and was part of the Siksika Nation. The 16-year-old was found murdered in the morning of January 1st, 2006, from a hit and run on the Trans-Canada Highway in Morley, Alberta. According to a medical certificate of her death, in this case, she had been run over by at least 2 other vehicles as her body was lying on the highway. None of them pulled over to help. The night before this happened, Brittany had asked to go to a dance on the 1st. When Brittany's parents realized she was missing, then heard someone was found on the highway, they immediately went home and unfortunately found the RCMP there. Originally, they were told Brittany had committed suicide by lying on the highway. This was purportedly due to the fact that the ME examining Brittany had written that she had made, quote, several references to self-harm shortly before she was found, end quote, and, quote, reportedly had a history of ethanol abuse, end quote, which were statements from alleged friends of Brittany's. The investigation sounds pretty poor. At one point, law enforcement lost Brittany's cell phone. The RCMP did state it was looking for 2 vehicles that might have a connection to her murder, a 1996 through 2000 red Toyota RAV4 and a 1999 through 2000 Pontiac Grand Am. Both vehicles would have likely sustained front-end damage. Friends and family state Brittany, who was a student at Morley Community School at the time, was full of dreams. She wanted to be a lawyer. She had a great sense of humor. She loved the powwow trail and listening to her favorite powwow music from the Northern Cree Singers and Whitefish Juniors. Geraldine stated she believes the RCMP gave up on her case because friends of Brittany that she had been with that night told the RCMP officers she was suicidal. Quote, they didn't even do a search. They hadn't even done an investigation, end quote, John said. Quote, how can you say she killed herself, end quote, adding the RCMP had taken some of Brittany's personal belongings as evidence, which again is including that cell phone. After a year of calling and following up with the RCMP with no leads on the initial hit and run, John called and asked to have her cell phone returned. Quote, she's got recordings on that phone with her voice, pictures of her on there, end quote, John said, adding that, quote, maybe there's something there that could have been seen and they might have missed, end quote. While initially being told it was in a safety deposit box inside the department and he couldn't have it while the investigation was active, he was later told they simply lost it. The RCMP, quote, they told us if we could find the receipt for the phone, we'll purchase you another one, end quote, John stated. It is that type of error that proves to the family that the investigation, if any, was not well conducted. John stated, quote, that really makes anyone wonder. Is it really what they said it is? If they can't hold down a piece of evidence like a cell phone, what makes you think that anything they're telling us is even true." End quote. According to Brittany's family, the second and third drivers who hit her turned themselves in and faced no charges. The first driver is still at large. Alberta RCMP would not confirm that information, and police reported at the time of her death there was no light on the stretch of highway through Morley, and they believed it was possible that the drivers thought they hit a deer, or perhaps they didn't realize they hit something at all, which the second part of that statement seems very out of character. Of course you're going to notice if you hit something, especially the size of a human. That was inappropriate. But that's unfortunately all the updates we have on her case at this time. Brooklynn Moose. Brooklynn Moose was born on February 24th, 1989, to parents Margaret Moose and Delbert Sabat. She was one of 10 children in the home growing up and was known for having a good sense of humor and an infectious smile. She grew up and was close with her family. By the time she was 25, she had 2 children of her own, son Damien McKay and daughter Navja Moose. Brooklynn rented a house in the 900 block of Athol Street near Regina's North Central neighborhood. Unfortunately, that area is known for drugs and violence. Brooklynn ended up having issues with her own roommate and had to ask her to leave in around December of 2014. After that, she received threats and even requested the locks be changed. And she ended up doing this not once, but twice, requesting it. On February 27th, 2015, Brooklynn called Margaret around 3 p.m. to say she was leaving a gathering at East Regina. The gathering had become more of a party, and a lot of people were drinking, and she just didn't want to, so she was just going to go home. That, unfortunately, is the last time families spoke with Brooklynn. In July of 2015, the Regina Police Service issued a press release asking for help finding Brooklynn. But of course, to add insult to injury, noted they had warrants out for her arrest, even if they were just for minor offenses. I couldn't even find what they were for. Not that that should matter. In September of 2015, Brooklynn's body was found. It was in the attic of the house she was renting. She was in a cramped area, so much so that firefighters were brought out to create a passage from the outside of the home to into the attic in order to get her out of there. Police began an investigation, but then in November of 2015, the house she was found in was set on fire. A person broke in, poured gas in the attic, and set the whole house on fire. The Regina Police Service conducted what spokesperson Elizabeth Popowich calls a lengthy, thorough investigation into Brooklynn's death, and their conclusion is of course going to be at odds with the family. It is with anybody who has a brain. Quote, "There was no evidence of foul play or criminal involvement in the death," end quote. Popowich wrote in an email to CBC News. The home's former manager also believed Brooklynn took her own life. According to him, he said he evicted Brooklynn shortly before she disappeared, and upon inspecting the home, he saw a television stand placed beneath the attic hatch, with a small amount of insulation on the floor. When he learned the young woman was missing, he called police and recommended they check the attic. Quote, "When the police officer opened it up, insulation, rained down on top of us. It was bags and bags of it," end quote. He said, quote, "I still think it was probably a suicide just because. There's only one way in and out of that attic. Nobody could get up there and put insulation on top of that door and close it. It's just impossible," end quote. I think it's odd to care about what the manager of the house said, but every report seems to put it in. I don't know if it swayed the investigation, but the previous one I just talked about, kids apparently swayed the investigation, so why not add this here? But also, I'm going to say you most certainly could set things up so that when opening a hatch, insulation would come down. That seems ludicrous to point out as evidence to suicide. What if she was put up there and still alive, but still stuck and fighting for her way out, causing things to shift? Or, how do people think booby traps are made? The fact that someone came in and torched the house is highly suspicious. Perhaps they're trying to make sure that no evidence was found. It seems insulting to report things as suicide simply because the investigation seems to be lacking. But again, That's one of the hundreds of reasons these stories need to be told more, to keep it in the light. And unfortunately, that's all the information we have on her case at this time. Remember, to all those out there listening, be careful. It's a dangerous world we live in.